Let's unpack all of this now with Antony Loewenstein. He's the author of The Palestine Laboratory and was also based as a journalist in occupied East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020. Speaking to us from Sydney. Antony, it's always good to have you on this program. When we look at the message that Blinken will be now wanting to convey when he meets Abbas and other regional leaders, what sort of diplomatic efforts do you think he is going to try to undertake here?
Not much is the short answer. And the reason I say that is that this situation reveals in the starkest way possible how utterly irrelevant virtually every single Arab leader has made themselves in relation to Israel-Palestine. They have zero leverage, zero. Mahmoud Abbas is not a legitimate leader anymore. I mean, essentially his term expired years ago. The leader of Jordan is not elected either. I mean, he essentially made a decision, as the Egyptian leader has years ago, to take US aid every year to have a quasi-peace with Israel. There is not much diplomatic pressure that can be applied. And more importantly, the US and much of the West, the EU, the UK, have given carte blanche to Israel to do essentially what they want in Gaza and elsewhere. So it's pretty rich to hear the idea that America is working the diplomatic phones to find some kind of negotiation. What concerns me particularly is I look forward to what might happen, not if, but I think when Hamas is removed politically from Gaza. I think that's inevitable. That will happen in a week, in a month, we don't know. And what happens then? And I fear that what the US and Israel might be imagining is the possibility of the Palestinian Authority coming in, like they do in the West Bank, as a contractor for the Israeli occupation to so-called manage Gaza. I mean, I think it would be catastrophic for so many reasons, but I fear that's what's being discussed behind the scenes.
With those fears, taking all of that into consideration, you've got these two fractured Palestinian sides. You've got Hamas, which is an armed struggle. You have the Palestinian Authority, which has always gone the diplomatic route. If we look where we are right now, none of it has worked. So where does this leave the Palestinian people? Because right now, the ones in Gaza are being killed. They have nowhere to go, literally nowhere to go, especially with this call that we're hearing about, with 1 million Gazans having to leave the north of the enclave. This is the situation you just kind of look at and think, where's it going to lead?
Well, this call from Israel to potentially try to move 1 million Palestinians within Gaza is kind of realising a lot of fears that many Palestinians have had for years, long before this current week, in relation to the possibility and the dream that many on the Israeli side have. The far-right government currently has talked openly about forced ethnic cleansing, about finding a trigger for that to happen. Now, admittedly, what Israel's suggesting is within Gaza, that's true, but the idea that you would potentially move or forcibly move or encourage 1 million Palestinians to move, of which there's only 2.3 million within Gaza, is kind of an insane proposition within 24 hours, seemingly impossible to do. And secondly, I think, as I've been hearing reports, very, very few Palestinians, if any, are going to do so because they don't even trust they can get back to their homes if they even exist. I mean, that's the fear. You know, you ask about what's the Palestinian strategy. I mean, I would argue that the Palestinian Authority hasn't chosen diplomacy, it's chosen capitulation. They made a decision, this is under Yasser Arafat back in the day, to essentially capitulate to US and Israeli interests in the vain hope in the 1990s that it would lead to some kind of state. Well, that was pretty clear by the late 90s that was not going to happen. And we are in a situation now where, without massive international pressure, boycott, divestment, sanctions, much more powerful civil society groups, the union movement getting involved, as happened during apartheid South Africa, that it was a collective action to put massive pressure on South Africa. This is obviously in the 70s and 80s, leading to its end in 1994. Something similar needs to happen here, because we cannot rely on governments to take appropriate action anymore.
But Antony, when we speak about that international pressure, that could take a long time, because if we look at South African, speaking as a South African, it took decades before we got to 1994, before there was a democratic government. So when you talk about the Israel-Palestinian situation, we're talking possibly years here of international pressure. Or do you think we could get to the point, because it's getting so deadly right now, that this could actually be strengthened from the international community? And who in the international community would possibly lead that?
Well, initially, it's going to be civil society. It's not going to be governments. I mean, the reason, for example, boycott, divestment, sanction was developed in 2005 by Palestinians in Palestine was essentially to say that we cannot rely on governments to liberate us, that if we're waiting for them, we're going to be waiting forever. Now, I don't deny at all that civil society and BDS and all those pressure points are going to happen today or tomorrow. The situation is getting so desperate and so bad. And putting aside even Gaza for a minute, as you've been reporting, there's increasing violence in the West Bank, huge amounts of people actually literally being ethnically cleansed from their towns as Palestinians in villages because life has become so intolerable thanks to threats from settlers and the Israeli army. I mean, again, right now it seems pretty hopeless. There's no way to get around that, and I speak to many Palestinians and Israeli Jews for that matter who are fundamentally opposed to what's going on here. But there needs to be some kind of rupture. There needs to be some kind of civil society outcry, and if there's going to be, which there seems to be, a ground invasion of Gaza, and we have huge amounts of death tolls, which I fear there will be on the Palestinian side, and frankly I'm sure a lot of Israeli troops are going to be killed as well. This needs to put massive pressure on the international community. It's no longer enough. It's no longer enough to simply say Israel do anything right or wrong. I mean, that has been the case for decades, and look at where we are now. It's disastrous.
Yeah, very well put. Disastrous and deadly. Antony Loewenstein, thank you so much for your analysis. Live to us there from Sydney.